"Can I sit here?" a sick little girl asked the stranger at the coffee shop. He turned out to be a widowed CEO, a man who had lost everything except the quiet ache in his chest. "Excuse me, can I sit here? I'm really tired." A small, fragile voice broke through the warm hum of the cafe. Daniel Harris looked up from his untouched espresso. The steam still curled in the air, untouched like the rest of his morning. A little girl, no older than the four, stood beside his table, holding the leash of a blind German shepherd with an orange blindfold. In her other arm, she clutched a worn teddy bear. Her hazel eyes, bright yet shadowed with exhaustion, met his, and something inside him shifted. It was one of those mornings when winter seemed to press its face against the glass of the city, breathing frost onto every window pane. The air was sharp, thin, the kind that nipped at ears and turned every exhale into a drifting cloud. A thin layer of snow dusted the red brick rooftops, while steam curled upward from the iron grates of street vents. The main street was quiet at this early hour, just a scattering of bundled-up pedestrians and the muted hum of a snowplow in the distance. Inside a small café on the corner, its walls lined with dark cedar panels and shelves of mismatched mugs, the air was rich with the scent of roasted coffee and warm pastries. Near the far corner sat Daniel Harris, a man whose presence seemed almost too crisp for the cozy space. Daniel was 38, tall, with the lean frame of someone who never quite lost the habit of morning runs, though the discipline had faded in recent years. His dark brown hair was cut neatly, but beginning to show strands of silver near the temples. A neatly trimmed beard framed a face that might have once been described as handsome, though now it carried the weight of someone who had lived too long with silence. His charcoal wool sweater and heavy overcoat spoke of understated wealth, but it was his eyes, gray, steady, distant, that told the truer story. They were the eyes of a man who had lost more than he could speak about. Daniel had been a successful tech CEO, building an empire out of calculated risks and relentless work. But 3 winters ago, his wife Claire had died of ovarian cancer, and 2 years later, his young son Ethan had been taken from him in a car accident while Daniel was abroad. Since then, the world had been an endless string of quiet rooms and conversations that never quite reached the heart. The espresso in front of him had gone cold, untouched. He sat with his back to the wall, scarf still looped neatly at his neck, eyes unfocused as he watched the slow swirl of snowflakes outside. The bell over the cafe door gave a soft chime, pulling his gaze toward the entrance. Through it stepped a small figure, a little girl no more than 4 years old, pushing the heavy door closed with both hands. She was bundled in a red woolen hat that seemed just a bit too big, the edges pulled down to cover her ears. Wisps of light brown hair peeked out from under it. Her cheeks were pale, but her eyes, large and hazel, were luminous, though shadowed by a tiredness far too old for her age. In one arm, she clutched a worn teddy bear with threadbare fur and one ear slightly frayed. The other hand gripped the leash of a German shepherd. The dog was striking, even at first glance. He was large, his once strong frame now slowed by the careful, deliberate way he moved. His fur was a blend of black and silver gray, but the most noticeable thing was the neatly tied orange blindfold that covered his eyes. His name, as Daniel would later learn, was Scout. 6 years old, Scout had once been a guide dog for a military veteran, until an explosion during an overseas tour damaged his vision beyond repair. Yet there was a dignified steadiness in the way he walked, each step sure despite the darkness. His ears twitched subtly, taking in the sounds around him. The girl stopped at Daniel's table, looking up at him with the kind of openness only children carry. Her voice was soft, but steady. "Can I sit here?" The question landed in the quiet air between them like a pebble dropped into still water. Daniel blinked, unsure why his first instinct was to glance at the empty chair opposite him, as if confirming it existed. He studied her for a moment. There was something in her gaze, a fragile determination that caught at something buried deep in him. Without speaking, he nodded and gestured to the chair. She smiled, a small, shy curve of the lips, and began the awkward climb onto the seat, her legs too short to reach the ground. Scout lowered himself carefully to the floor beside her, curling into a neat, resting position. Daniel's scarf was still around his neck, warm from his skin. Almost without thinking, he unwound it and leaned forward, draping it over her small shoulders. "You looked cold," he said quietly. She glanced down at the scarf, then up at him, and for a moment he saw pure, unfiltered trust in her eyes. She placed her teddy bear gently on the table, patting its head as though introducing it. "This is Hope," she whispered. "She's tired too." Daniel felt the corner of his mouth twitch, the closest he had come to a smile in months. He looked down at Scout, whose ears were angled toward him, as though reading the change in his voice. From across the cafe, a woman's voice rang out, edged with worry. "Maddie!" Grace Cooper approached quickly, weaving between tables. She was in her early 30s, with dark hair pulled back into a loose braid that had begun to unravel. Her height was average, her build slender, but carrying the wiry strength of someone used to hard work. A navy winter coat, worn thin at the elbows, hung open over a faded sweater. The boots on her feet were scuffed, the soles uneven from years of wear. Grace's hazel eyes, like her daughter's, were alert, the kind of eyes that measured both kindness and danger in equal weight. Life had taught her caution. Years of scraping by as a single mother, working night shifts, and navigating hospital corridors for Maddie's treatments had carved resilience into her posture. She reached the table, placing a protective hand on Maddie's shoulder. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry. She does this sometimes. I didn't mean for her to bother you." Daniel shook his head slowly. "She's fine," he said. "Really?" Grace hesitated, her gaze flicking from the expensive wool of his coat to the leather gloves set neatly beside his cup, then to the unreadable calm on his face. There was no threat there, but she still felt the urge to retreat. Maddie, however, was humming softly to Hope, wrapped snug in Daniel's scarf. "Thank you," Grace said quietly, though her tone carried the weight of unfinished sentences. "But we should go." She took the teddy bear from the table and guided Maddie down from the chair. Scout rose smoothly to his feet, pressing close to the little girl's side. Daniel sat back, saying nothing, as he watched them leave. Through the window, he saw Grace lift Maddie into her arms, the child's small face pressed into her mother's shoulder. Outside, the snowflakes swirled around them. Scout's head tilted slightly, listening to the world he could not see, his gait slow but unwavering. As the door swung closed, the cafe grew quiet again. Daniel's scarf remained draped across the now empty chair. His coffee was cold, and somewhere inside him, beneath years of carefully maintained attachment, something shifted. It wasn't grief, it wasn't guilt. It was faint, almost fragile, but it was warm. 3 days later, the morning in Asheville wore a veil of pale silver. Beaver Lake lay still under a thin skin of mist, its surface smooth as glass, disturbed only by the occasional ripple from a distant duck. The shoreline was edged with bare trees, their skeletal branches stretching toward a muted winter sky. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and pine, the kind of scent that hinted at snow yet to come. Daniel Harris had chosen the lake deliberately. After years of back-to-back meetings, tight schedules, and the hum of fluorescent office lights, he'd come to value these slow, solitary walks. The sound of his boots crunching lightly over the frozen grass was a kind of therapy, something that reminded him he was still part of the world beyond polished conference tables. He wore a dark pea coat today, its collar turned up against the breeze, and his gloved hands rested loosely in his pockets. He was halfway around the curve of the lake when a burst of laughter, high, bright, and unrestrained, cut through the muffled quiet. He turned toward the sound. There, near the park's old wooden swing set, was Maddie Cooper. She was bundled in a puffy lilac coat, a knit hat with 2 floppy pom-poms bobbing as she swung, her legs pumped in quick, determined arcs, boots flashing with each kick. At her feet, sprawled in the protective shadow of the swing's support beam, lay Scout, the German shepherd. Daniel had met 3 days earlier. The dog was curled in a resting pose, his thick coat flecked with tiny white bits of frost that had caught in the fur. His orange blindfold was tied neatly, and though he could not see, his ears rotated slightly with each creak of the swing chains, tracking Maddie's movements. Maddie spotted him almost instantly. Her face lit up. "Scarf man!" She leaped from the swing with more enthusiasm than precision, landed slightly off balance, and then ran to him. Before Daniel could even react, she wrapped her small arms around his leg. Daniel's lips curved in a faint smile. "I'm surprised you remember me." Maddie looked up, her eyes wide. You gave me your scarf, and hope was warm. She pointed toward the teddy bear sticking out of her coat pocket. A voice called from the bench nearby. Maddie, careful. Grace Cooper stood, closing the paperback book in her hands. She wore a forest green coat today, buttoned unevenly, and a cream scarf that looked hand-knit. Her dark hair was tucked under a simple gray beanie. She approached at an easy pace, though her watchful gaze never left her daughter. When she reached them, she nodded in greeting, her expression softer than it had been in the café. You two know each other now, I see, Grace said, her tone carrying the hint of a smile. Maddie answered for him. We met at the coffee shop, and Scout likes him. Daniel looked down at the dog, who had padded up beside Maddie. Scout lifted his head, the tip of his black nose twitching in Daniel's direction. Without hesitation, Daniel knelt, resting a gloved hand gently on Scout's neck. The dog's ears tilted forward, then he leaned in and pressed his muzzle against Daniel's hand. Grace seemed to notice the subtle exchange. He doesn't do that with just anyone, she said quietly. Scout's careful. Always has been. They all moved toward the bench where Grace had been sitting. Maddie climbed up first, swinging her legs, while Scout positioned himself directly in front of her, his body forming a protective barrier. Daniel took a seat on the opposite end, leaving a respectful space. Grace's hands folded in her lap. Maddie has leukemia, she said after a moment, her voice even but subdued. We've been waiting for a bone marrow match. It's a lot of hospital time, a lot of waiting. Daniel listened, the winter breeze ruffling his hair. I'm sorry, he said simply. Grace shrugged lightly. We do what we have to. I work nights as a nurse over at St. Mary's. Pick up dishwashing shifts at the diner when I can. Keeps the lights on. Daniel glanced at Scout, lying calmly now, with his head on his paws. Grace followed his gaze. He used to be a guide dog for a veteran, Tom Riley, served 2 tours overseas. There was an IED blast. Scout lost his sight, but saved Tom's life in the process. Tom says he owed Scout more than anyone could ever repay. When Tom's health went downhill, Scout came to us. Maddie and Scout, they've been inseparable since. While Grace spoke, movement flickered in the distance. Across the park, near the entrance path, a woman lingered just beyond the rail fence, angled toward them. She was bundled in a beige quilted coat, a burgundy scarf tucked neatly around her neck, and held a phone raised ever so slightly. This was Ellen Morris, Grace's neighbor. Ellen was in her late 50s, of medium build, with a short, practical haircut the color of steel. She had the sharp-eyed alertness of someone who missed very little and shared even less about her own life. In the neighborhood, she was known for her concerned questions and habit of noticing details others might overlook. Years earlier, Ellen had lost her husband suddenly to a heart attack, and since then she'd developed an almost compulsive interest in the personal lives of those around her, part vigilance, part loneliness. From where she stood, Ellen could see the trio clearly: Grace, the child, the expensive coat on the man who didn't seem to fit the usual scenery. Her thumb moved across her phone screen. A soft click of the camera shutter was swallowed by the rustle of wind through the reeds. Daniel, unaware of the watchful eyes, rested his hand again on Scout's head. This boy still senses everything, he murmured. Scout responded by lifting his head and nudging Daniel's wrist with his nose, a slow, deliberate motion that seemed almost like understanding. The touch startled something. In Daniel, an echo of the gentle, trusting way Ethan's small hand used to grip his finger. For a moment, he let the feeling settle before speaking again. You can lose a lot, but maybe not the parts that matter most. Grace didn't reply right away. She simply studied him, as though weighing the truth of his words. Then Maddie slid off the bench, pulling gently at Scout's leash. Come on, Scout. Let's go to the slide, she chirped. The dog rose instantly, following the sound of her voice without hesitation. Grace stood too. She'll want to run you ragged if you stay long, she said, a hint of amusement threading through the words. Daniel rose from the bench. I think I can handle it. As they walked toward the playground together, the low winter sun broke briefly through the clouds, casting their shadows long across the frost-tipped grass. Behind them, Ellen lowered her phone, a contemplative expression on her face. She stayed only a moment longer before turning away, already composing the words she might share later. Over the next few weeks, winter settled deeper into Asheville, wrapping the small mountain city in a quiet hush. The snow along the sidewalks had turned to pale slush in some places, yet the air still carried a crisp bite that reddened cheeks and stung fingertips. For Daniel Harris, the routine of his mornings began to shift, not toward the boardroom or the endless stream of emails, but toward a certain café on the corner of Maple Street. It started subtly. He would arrive early, choosing the same table near the window, pretending to work through reports on his laptop. But the truth was simpler. He was waiting. And every morning, like clockwork, they came. Maddie would spot him first, her small figure bouncing in excitement as she tugged on Scout's leash. The German shepherd, despite the orange blindfold and his measured steps, seemed to sense Daniel's presence just as keenly as the child did. He would wag his tail slowly, weaving around Daniel's legs once they reached him, nudging at his coat pocket where the scent of treats lingered. "Brought you something," Daniel would say each time, producing a paper bag with a warm blueberry muffin for Maddie and a soft bone treat for Scout. Maddie would grin, crumbs dotting her cheeks within moments. Grace, at first, kept her distance, offering polite thank yous, nothing more. But as the weeks passed, the space between them began to shrink. She would sometimes join him at the table, her posture still guarded, though now punctuated by the occasional genuine smile. One late February morning, the sky was overcast, promising snow by evening. Daniel sat with Maddie at their usual table, while Grace went to the counter to order coffee. Maddie was happily humming to her teddy bear, Hope, when Scout suddenly stiffened. The change was immediate, his ears pricked forward, head turning sharply toward the lakeside path, visible through the cafe window. Then came the low, warning growl, followed by two sharp barks. Daniel's head snapped up. "What is it, boy?" Scout rose to his feet, pulling lightly against the leash, his body angling toward the door. Daniel followed his lead, stepping outside into the brittle air. The lake lay a short distance away, the path winding through brittle grass and patches of lingering snow. His heart began to race as he caught sight of a small figure slumped near the bend in the trail. "Maddie!" She was lying on her side, pale as the snow beneath her, her knit hat slightly askew. Daniel rushed forward, kneeling beside her. Her eyelids fluttered weakly. Her breathing was shallow. He scooped her into his arms without hesitation, the cold seeping through his coat as Scout stayed close, his body pressed against Daniel's leg, as if guiding him back. By the time Grace appeared, coffee cups abandoned on the cafe counter, Daniel was already striding toward the parking lot. She fainted. "Call ahead to St. Mary's," he said, his voice tight but controlled. The hospital was only a 10-minute drive, but it felt longer. Inside the bright, sterile ER, a doctor in navy scrubs, Dr. Evan Mills, a man in his mid-40s with graying hair and a calm, practiced demeanor, met them at the doors. Known among staff for his steady hand in emergencies and his ability to deliver bad news with unflinching compassion, Dr. Mills quickly examined Maddie. "She's had a sudden platelet drop," he explained, his voice low but urgent. "Leukemia-related. You got her here just in time." Grace's face drained of color, her hand tightening around Maddie's small fingers, as the nurses wheeled her toward the pediatric unit. Daniel stood a step back, the sight of the child hooked to monitors, stirring a deep ache he thought he had locked away forever. As Maddie was stabilized, Grace finally turned to him. "Thank you," she whispered, the words sounding reluctant but genuine. Daniel shook his head. "I was just there." Outside the hospital walls, in another part of town, a different story was unfolding. At a small kitchen table cluttered with yesterday's newspaper and a half-finished jigsaw puzzle, Ellen Morris sat hunched over her phone. The photos she had taken at Beaver Lake weeks earlier, Daniel, Grace, Maddie, and Scout, framed in the winter sunlight, were now attached to an email draft addressed to a contact at a local gossip outlet. Ellen's reasoning was muddled even to herself. Perhaps it was curiosity, perhaps an unspoken need to feel important in someone else's narrative. By mid-afternoon, the article was live. The headline, written in bold, carried just enough bite to stir speculation. "Billionaire CEO and single mother, heartwarming story, or clever PR stunt." Beneath it, Ellen's photos were laid out. Daniel kneeling to pet Scout, Maddie beaming, Grace sitting on the bench in her worn coat. Within hours, the piece was being shared across social media, accompanied by comment threads thick with assumptions. Words like charity case, image boost, and publicity popped up again and again. Grace didn't see the article that day, but she noticed the shift almost immediately. Neighbors lingered a little too long at their doors when she walked past. A cashier at the corner store asked if that rich man was really helping her. The questions carried an edge that made her stomach twist. That evening, back in her apartment, Grace sat at the kitchen table, watching Maddie and Scout curled together on the couch. Maddie's energy had returned after the transfusion, her laughter filling the room in soft bursts. Yet, Grace couldn't shake the way people had looked at her today. She thought of Daniel's quiet generosity, the treats for Maddie, the way he had carried her daughter without hesitation. And still, a thread of doubt wound its way in, fueled not by what she knew, but by what she feared others might believe. In another part of town, Daniel sat alone in his home office, Scout's, a soft bone treat still in his pocket from the morning. He didn't know about the article yet, but he would soon enough. The morning broke brittle and pale, the thermometer on the corner pharmacy flashing -3 degrees Celsius in cold, unfriendly red. A thin wind scoured Asheville's narrow streets, carrying with it loose threads of snow that drifted like smoke between the buildings. Outside the café on Maple Street, the awning flapped faintly in the breeze, its edges crusted with frost. Grace Cooper stepped out first, pulling her coat tighter around her, as Scout's steady, cautious steps crunched behind her. Maddie followed, her gloved hands clutching the leash loosely. She wore her lilac puffer jacket. The zipper tugged all the way up, but her cheeks were flushed with a deeper red than the weather alone could explain. "Mama..." Maddie's voice was faint, thinner than usual. Her hand slackened on the leash. Scout stopped abruptly, his ears twitching at the subtle change in her breathing. Grace turned just in time to see her daughter sway on her feet, knees buckling. The child's head drooped forward. "Maddie..." Before she could react further, Daniel Harris was already crossing the sidewalk toward them, his black wool coat whipping in the wind. "She's burning up," Grace said, her voice breaking. Daniel bent without hesitation, scooping Maddie into his arms. She was hot against his chest, her head lolling onto his shoulder. Scout circled anxiously, barking short, urgent notes that drew glances from passers-by. "I'll drive," Daniel said, his tone clipped but calm. Grace climbed into the passenger seat of his SUV, Scout leaping into the back in one fluid motion for a dog who couldn't see. The ride to St. Mary's Hospital cut through streets that felt strangely longer in the cold. At the entrance, the automatic doors sighed open to the antiseptic warmth inside. Nurses in pale blue scrubs moved quickly toward them, guiding Maddie into a triage room. Daniel stayed close, his hand lightly on Grace's arm as they followed. Inside, Maddie was eased onto a hospital bed, her coat and hat removed to reveal sweat-damp hair sticking to her forehead. Her breathing was shallow, skin hot to the touch. A doctor entered. Dr. Lillian Chen, a woman in her early 40s with almond-shaped eyes framed by rectangular glasses. Her jet-black hair was pulled into a tight bun, and her voice carried a calm that seemed to slow the panic in the room. Known for her meticulous diagnostic skills, Dr. Chen had a reputation for treating each patient as if they were her own family, shaped by losing her younger brother to illness in her 20s. "Febrile episode," she said after a quick assessment. "Likely infection from immunosuppression. Will start forth antibiotics and fluids immediately." Grace sat beside the bed, holding Maddie's limp hand. Daniel pulled up a chair on the other side, not speaking, but his presence was steady. Scout lay at Grace's feet, his head resting gently against Maddie's mattress. The slow thump of his tail the only sign he registered, the voices around him. Hours passed under the soft hiss of oxygen and the rhythmic beeps of monitors. Daniel remained there, rising only to bring Grace a cup of coffee or to speak quietly with the nurses. Grace didn't send him away, and in the dim hospital light, it felt almost like a truce neither had named. By morning, Maddie's fever had eased, her breathing more even. Grace's eyes were heavy from the sleepless night. A nurse entered with discharge paperwork, a small smile on her face. "Your balance has been cleared," she said to Grace. "Mr. Harris took care of it." Grace froze. The words landed like a weight. She turned to Daniel, her voice low and sharp. "You think I'm a charity case?" Daniel's expression didn't shift, but his voice was measured. No, I just couldn't stand by and watch. Before he could finish, Grace's phone buzzed. A message from her neighbor, Deborah Holt, a retired postal worker with a tendency to forward every piece of gossip she encountered, flashed on the screen. Thought you should see this, it read, followed by a link. Grace clicked, and there it was, the article. The headline blared, "Billionaire CEO and Single Mother, Heartwarming Story or Clever PR Stunt." The photos were unmistakable. Daniel kneeling to pet Scout at Beaver Lake, Maddie smiling up at him, Grace in her worn coat beside them. The text beneath suggested calculated generosity and image rehabilitation. Her stomach twisted. "You staged this," she said, each word clipped. Daniel stepped toward her. "Grace, I didn't—" She shook her head, cutting him off. "I should have known. People like you, there's always an angle." Grace gathered Maddie's coat, gently lifting her still sleepy daughter into her arms. Scout rose immediately, pressing to her side. Without another glance at Daniel, she walked toward the sliding doors. The cold outside rushed in as they opened, swallowing her and the dog in a swirl of snow. Daniel stood motionless, the distant sound of traffic muffled by the thickening storm. Later that evening, back in his house, the wind howled through the eaves. He wandered into the room that had once been his son's, untouched since the accident, blue walls with faded dinosaur decals, a bed neatly made, a toy rocket on the nightstand. He sat in the desk chair, hands clasped, the silence pressing in until all that remained was the echo of what had been. The days after the confrontation felt longer than they should have. Asheville's winter sky hung low, the clouds the color of tarnished silver. Grace Cooper busied herself with work and hospital visits, but Maddie's silence whenever Daniel's name came up was telling. The little girl had always been bright, but now she spent more time sitting by the window, holding her teddy bear and stroking Scout's fur in slow, absent motions. Scout, for his part, seemed to notice the change. The 6-year-old German shepherd, his orange blindfold tied neatly over his eyes, had been quieter. He followed Maddie everywhere, his steady steps matching hers, sometimes resting his head on her lap, as if to offer a wordless reassurance. One evening, after Grace had stepped out to answer a phone call from the hospital billing department, Maddie pulled a crumpled piece of paper and a stubby pencil from her school bag. She leaned over the kitchen table, tongue peeking from the corner of her mouth in concentration. In uneven, slightly wobbly letters, she wrote, "I miss you and Scout." She added a crooked little heart at the bottom, then folded the paper carefully. The next morning, Maddie waited until Grace was occupied washing dishes, then slipped the note into her coat pocket. She took Scout's leash, clipping it gently to his harness. "Come on, boy," she whispered. The dog tilted his head, listening, then followed her lead without hesitation. They moved slowly down the apartment building's stairwell, Scout's nails clicking softly against the worn linoleum steps. The air outside was sharp with the scent of impending snow. Maddie's boots crunched over the salt scattered on the sidewalk as she led Scout along the familiar route to the café on Maple Street, the place where she had first met Scarf Man. Scout walked steadily beside her, the leash slack between them. Inside, the café's bell chimed as the door opened. Daniel Harris, seated at his usual corner table, glanced up from the coffee he had been staring into for the past half hour. His eyes widened slightly, disbelief giving way to something warmer. Maddie stood just inside the doorway, her cheeks pink from the cold, Scout at her side. "Maddie!" Daniel rose, crossing the floor quickly. He knelt, arms open. The girl stepped forward and buried her face into his coat. Scout pressed against Daniel's knee, tail giving a single, slow wag. "I'm sorry," Daniel murmured, his voice low and unsteady. "I won't disappear again. I promise." They sat together for a while, Maddie sipping hot chocolate, Scout lying at their feet, until the doorbell chimed again. Grace stepped inside, her posture tense. She had clearly hurried, strands of dark hair had escaped her braid, and her scarf was loosely knotted. Her hazel eyes flicked from Maddie to Daniel. "We need to talk," she said simply. They chose a quiet corner table, Maddie and Scout nearby. Daniel began with the truth. How? He had not known about the article until after it was published, how it had been Ellen Morris who had taken and sold the photos. He spoke without defense in his tone, but with an urgency that made it clear he didn't want this to be the last conversation between them. Grace listened, her hands wrapped around a mug for warmth. She thought of the moments Daniel had been there without being asked. The blueberry muffins for Maddie, the soft bone treats for Scout, the night he stayed at the hospital without leaving her side. Finally, she exhaled. If you want to stay, stay as part of us, not as a visitor. That afternoon, the three of them walked to Beaver Lake. The snow had not yet fallen, and the water was calm, reflecting the pale gold of the winter sun. They found a bench near the shore, and Maddie climbed up between them, her legs swinging. Scout lay down at their feet, his head resting lightly on Maddie's boots, his ears flicking at the sound of distant ducks. For a long time, they said nothing, just watched the light shift over the water. And in that quiet, the unspoken was understood. Three hearts that had been wandering had found a place to rest. Sometimes the miracles God sends are not wrapped in lightning or thunder, but in the quiet steps of a blind dog, the small hands of a child, and the courage to open our hearts again. In our busy days, we can miss these gentle blessings if we are not watching. This story reminds us that God's love often reaches us through people and moments we never expected, healing wounds we thought would never close. If this touched your heart, take a moment to share this video so others can feel this hope. Leave a comment with Amen to thank God for the unseen miracles in your life. And if you believe in second chances and the power of kindness, subscribe to this channel so we can keep spreading stories that lift the spirit. May the Lord bless you and your family today and always.